All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm excited to have a good sized group here with us today to talk about mobility in the 2023 legislative session. And we like to start off these sessions, depending on the size. We've done introductions. I think we're a little too large today, so we're inviting people to do that in the chat. And that way we can get a sense of who all is here and for that networking. And so we are going to be focused today on some really exciting legislative work that's been going on. And so I'm happy to have some of my compatriots from the world of Policy Action 2023 joining us today. So Josh Caldwell from Natural Resources Council of Maine and Cochrane from Maine Youth Action. And actually we have a few other folks who are here who've been informing that process. So we'll definitely give you an opportunity to join the chat. Just a few words about Moving Maine. So the Moving Maine network is really, it's us. So it's the folks who come together to do this work around improving access to transportation and mobility. And, you know, with a emphasis on people who have barriers. And we really intentionally want to bring people to the table from across different perspectives, and one of those is lived experience. So we make a big effort to bring people to the table who are, you know, who use the bus, who are not able to drive, maybe don't have a driver's license. And so if you know somebody who you can help us engage, we would love to have that help. It's also important to have folks who work in all the different organizations and community groups that focus on transportation. These sessions are an opportunity for us to network with one another, to hear about what's going on and get ideas, and to move to action. And so we love to know that folks made a connection here and then they reached out to somebody after the fact, and together we're able to take action. Our plan for today is to first talk a bit about the bill that Josh and Cole are working on, and because I know Cole actually has to go back to the legislature today, so we'll get to that shortly. But before we jump in, I did want to share that we've been part of a process that is called Policy Action 2023. And I'm actually not going to share slides. I don't really think they're necessary, but I will put a couple links into the chat after I finish talking that you can get a lot more information. But in a nutshell, the Moving Maine network joined on with many partners around the state in this legislative action process led by Grow Smart Maine and Build Maine. And there were two tracks to that focus on transportation. And so I have been pretty involved with the piece around making safer streets, and also somewhat involved with the transit funding, public transportation funding piece. And we are moving forward as Policy Action 2023 group to develop ways that can make it really easy to have your voice heard. And so as these bills, and we actually are sort of like, I'm grateful that our bills have not gotten into hearings quite yet. But we hope that you feel inspired and informed today to have your voice heard and bring in the voices of folks who aren't here and maybe who are less likely to show up at public meetings, to have all of our voices heard, so we can get the transportation system that we all in this group certainly agree is needed. So we'll be sharing links to some materials that are available that you can peruse. But for today, we wanted to give you an overview of the bills and then chat about how to testify and how to it's, you know, how to basically, what we're hoping is you come out of today feeling inspired and realizing how easy it is to give your 2 cents. And if you want help giving your 2 cents, there's also a way to get help for that. Or if you're, you know, if you want to write a letter and have somebody else look at it, that kind of thing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Josh and Cole. Josh, I did make you co-host so you can share slides if you want to, but I'm going to let you decide.
I think we'll keep it discussion oriented for now, and I hope folks feel free to reach out with questions. This is how our whole process has been from last September when I first got engaged with the Policy Action Working Group. I love the opportunity to communicate our ideas and intentions and then gather feedback from folks that we're chatting with about what could make our legislative work even stronger. And I want to mention testifying is so easy that Cole is on a webinar while testifying at the State House. So really glad to have you on, Cole. You're looking dapper.
Thank you very much.
So, of course. Just to give, I'll do a quick introduction, then Cole will do a quick introduction, and then I'll dive into the context of this bill. So my name is Josh Caldwell. I work with the Natural Resources Council of Maine on their climate and clean energy team, focusing on outreach and communications. I became involved with the Policy Action 2023 work, as I mentioned last fall, focusing specifically on diversifying Maine's transportation system and increasing funding to our public transportation system. I'll pass it over to Cole.
My name's Cole. I'm the policy director at Maine Youth Action, which is a statewide youth advocacy group that represents hundreds of Mainers from varying backgrounds. And obviously, as young Mainers, we focus a lot on our environment, and we consider that to be a paramount priority. And one of the products out of that came to be public transportation. And we've been working on it for a couple of years now, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what the final product will be.
Awesome. Thanks, Cole. So I took on the responsibility of being a bus driver for the Policy Action Group #2 to coordinate a lot of different stakeholders contributing ideas about how we can make our public transit infrastructure stronger. Cole has been our bill lead and has really been the catalyst for the ideas and the content behind the bill, and has been coordinating with our legislative sponsor, Representative Maggie O'Neill. So I'm going to jump in with some background about our process, and then Cole will get into some of the specifics about the bill itself, and then I believe we'll have a couple minutes for questions, right, Zoe? Awesome. So the bill has not yet been printed, but we are finalizing language as we speak. The title as of right now is an act to strategically advance the state's public transit infrastructure by reinvigorating the Public Transit Advisory Council and increasing funding. A bit clunky, but it's very accurate. As I mentioned, it's sponsored by Representative Maggie O'Neill of Saco, and she's been heavily involved in the process and a really phenomenal legislative ally. So this bill came to be in large part because Maine's transportation system, as you all know, is pretty one-dimensional. We're a very car-dependent state. Nearly 90% of people in Maine commute to work in a single occupancy vehicle. And there are a whole host of other statistics I could share there, including the fact that 2021 was the most dangerous year to date for Maine pedestrians. So our roads are increasingly dangerous and polluting due to single occupancy vehicle use and car dependency throughout the state. The other factor here is that public transit ridership took a big hit during the pandemic and is struggling to recover. Our system was already vastly underfunded to begin, and so we've now been left with a network of transit agencies that are struggling to meet the basic needs of their constituents. So through the Grow Smart Maine Policy Action 2023 process and through the committed work of Maine Youth Action pushing forward on the legislative side, we pulled together stakeholders representing a really wide variety of groups, ranging from economic development folks to transit operators, youth groups like Maine Youth Action, chambers of commerce, municipalities, environmental groups like the Natural Resources Council of Maine, and others to craft this legislation, ensuring that the legislation is reflective of the needs of all of those stakeholders. And as I mentioned, we've been meeting since last September to craft this legislation. Several predominating themes arose that we knew we wanted to address with this bill. First and foremost, we have to diversify Maine's transportation system, both to reduce emissions from our transportation sector and to actually meet the needs of all Mainers where they are. Over half of Maine's emissions come from the transportation sector. Those are carbon emissions contributing to climate change. It's Plan A in Maine's climate action plan to address those emissions from the transportation sector, but that plan does not speak very specifically to transit and the role that transit can play in getting people out of cars. So we wanted to make sure to bulk up that piece during this legislative session. 72% of older Mainers live outside of a fixed or flexed transit route and are aging out of driving ability. So that leaves our state really dangerously disconnected and reliant upon relational networks for really important trips to medical appointments, grocery store, etc. Next, we knew that we had to support our local transit agencies with funding and planning assistance. Many of the agencies are really hanging on by a thread, and sometimes only due to increased federal funding from recent federal packages that is going to run out shortly. So we wanted to ensure with this bill to increase funding for those local transit agencies so that they can continue and expand their operations. Even the more urban and larger transit agencies are tight on costs due to the pandemic and to the systematic underfunding of transit in the state of Maine. But in order to expand service, we first have to ensure that the agencies are getting their bare minimum needs met. And right now, those needs are largely operating costs. So we've proposed a substantial increase in state funding to support local transit agencies' operating costs. And by increasing that state contribution, we can alleviate the pressures of local match for transit agencies that can't afford to put money up to meet incoming state or federal funding requirements. The last part of this bill before I pass it over to Cole to get into the nitty-gritty is we knew we had to strengthen and diversify the Public Transit Advisory Council, or PTAC. This body only met once last year, and to our knowledge, it has relatively little sway in directing the Maine Department of Transportation to make needed changes regarding public transit. So we wanted to ensure through this legislation to strengthen and diversify that group with a lot of contributing voices and set up a reporting mechanism from that group to the Maine Department of to the Maine Department of Transportation and to the legislature so that that group can better inform our planning for the future of our transit system. So I'm going to pass it over now to Cole for a bit of a deeper dive into the specifics of the legislation, and then we'll have some time for questions.
Thank you, Josh. I just first want to preface that I am currently in my car. I am not in a room with a laptop. So forgive me if I keep flipping or if I sound a little incoherent, because I'm looking at the Google document so I can be as accurate as possible. A lot of what Josh said is amazing, and I would say honestly transformative for the public transportation arena. Like, I feel like there has been certainly a diversification of advocacy groups in this area, especially like from environmental groups like NRCM and Sierra Club, youth groups like Maine Youth Action and Maine Youth for Climate Justice. And I think it's certainly empowering to see that. And I think we need to ride off of that momentum into this session. And that's why this legislation is intended to be transformative and very progressive. So without further ado, I'm going to go through and go to my Google Doc about it. So I think like the first thing that we decided on was amending Title 23, which is kind of like the goals of Maine DOT. There's a certain part of it that talks about how the Department of Transportation has to make capital investment decisions, project decision making, all centered around this criteria within this statute. And we started to amend it so we can include specific language around public transportation and how we need to start encouraging alternative modes of transportation. That's kind of riddled throughout the Title 23 now as it amended. And I think that this is certainly a symbolic change within the department. If you look at this piece of language, and I'll send a link for the Google document if you don't have it already. But if you look at the language right now, it focuses a lot on highways, roads, bridges, single occupancy vehicles. And I think that we can certainly change the language where it's more up to date with the current interests of the state. So we added in language around public transportation. We also added in around like environmental impact, because one thing we know is that public transportation helps support the climate action response for the state. 54% of our emissions, and I forgot in Josh's speech if he mentioned this or not, but 54% of Maine's greenhouse gas emissions come from the transportation sector, and they are overwhelmingly from single occupancy vehicles. So we added in language around how we need to start reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, especially in accordance with the emissions reduction targets established by the state, which is implying reference to the Maine Won't Wait climate action plan. So I think I find that important, especially as a youth group that focuses on environmental interest. I think that this definitely directs the department to look at alternative modes of transportations that reduce emissions per capita, and kind of put an emphasis that the Department of Transportation is not the Department of Cars or Department of Highways, it's transportation. So I think that was like one of the overlying bits of legislation. But other than that, one major thing that Josh pointed out was the Public Transit Advisory Council reform. I think from my understanding, and I think Josh also brought some points on this, but the Public Transit Advisory Council was kind of dormant. It was kind of used as a rubber stamp by DOT. You know, like when they go through the transit plan, they'll have the PTAC review it, but it wasn't really substantive changes. It wasn't really a thorough recommendation process. So what we really wanted to do was change it where the Public Transit Advisory Council was an actual force within DOT that can help direct the statewide strategy of public transportation. Because at this point, we have amazing local transit operators. Even just a shout out right now to Aaron from KV Cap, like a lot of passionate transit operators like Aaron. But we also need some statewide coordination and strategy so it can help commuters get across the state and not just within their respective regions. So within the PTAC, what we decided to do is start changing the directives first. So it included language now about how they start creating the state transit plan. So they are staffed by DOT and they'll go through the process of creating the state transit plan, not simply adding in final last minute recommendations. Being early in that process means that the members of the PTAC, which include like transit operators, private bus operators, and includes Youth Now, immigration groups, labor, like they're all able to have their say early on, and it's not as cemented. And that's why it's so important that the PTAC is reformed to this. So there's that directive that we have in there as well. They have a lot more responsibility around reports to the Transportation Committee regarding the state of public transportation. I have to scroll down a little bit to get to that part. But essentially, like what they're focusing on is like reporting to the Transportation Committee the state of existing public transportation services and their recommendations alongside the state transit plan. So this section is kind of allowing the legislature to have time to process this information from the Public Transit Advisory Council and then have the authority to create committee bills from it, which is a game changer because now the legislature can act using information from DOT, and instead of having legislators who are typically volunteer basis create legislation on their own. So I think that this is definitely streamlines the process and makes it more accessible. So public transit improvements come in more frequently through the legislature and kind of change the state of our public transportation system. But other than that, membership, I think I touched on this just a little bit. We added in members for our youth, for our immigration groups, for environmental interest, and for labor. And I think this helps diversify it. And we have also kind of amended like membership requirements within current members. I think that it has definitely helped diversify the group and emphasize that the Public Transit Advisory Council is a stakeholder group. It's supposed to represent people across the state, let them have their say, and then have DOT help execute what their opinions are on the matter. So I think what we're expecting from this PTAC reform is major changes with like how the legislature gets their information, how stakeholders are represented within this, and making that process overall transparent. You can kind of see the incoherent part right now as I speak because I'm like still scrolling through. So apologies for that, but I just find that part to be super important. So I wanted to make sure I was like getting in all the details. Besides that, we also have some action items in here regarding appropriations. So as Josh said, like the major point or the major issue that local transit operators are facing right now is the lack of funding and also federal funding running out this year. So I think that what our group kind of decided on is that it's the responsibility of the state to make sure that these operations are still in place, because we already have a fragmented system of public transportation, and adding another problem of lacking federal funding will not help the situation, will not get towards our emission targets, and it certainly will not help people have an affordable, reliable, and accessible mode of transportation. So within the bill, we decided to appropriate $13.6 million from the general fund to the highway fund for solely transit operating cost. And that would be over 2 fiscal years. And this amount is intended to help address the kind of like the gap that will be there when federal funding runs out. So this amount will help maintain existing operations. And then we have a second one that's a one-time general fund appropriation of $25 million, which will help towards increasing subsidies for bus transit operating and capital funds. And it's also kind of separated and distributed out, so it helps address the state transit plan, it helps day-to-day operations, and I think there are also language in there about a mobility management program, which Zoe recommended. So if she does want to get into more detail about that, I highly recommend it. The last initiative in this bill, I would say, is creating 2 positions as a public service coordinator, which would support the transit planning assistance for those 2 fiscal years. And that's kind of like building off of the work for the PTAC, building off the work of the mobility management program. It really will help kind of coordinate all the local transit operations across the state, so we can have a coherent and accessible mode of public transportation statewide. So I know that was a big ramble, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. But I think that this is truly a transformative bill, and I think that with the amount of advocacy groups that are involved, and with people like yourselves that may testify at public hearings or reach out to your legislators, I think it really will make a significant impact on the outcome of this bill.
Truly. Thanks for being here, Cole, in the midst of your State House responsibilities. Clearly the product of months and months of dedicated work by a lot of stakeholders to inform how we can best update our transit system to be reflective of the needs of all Mainers, regardless of what your community looks like. So with that, happy to answer questions or pass it back over to Zoe if there is another direction we're moving.
I'd love to open it up to questions for a few minutes if there are any.
You were thorough, Cole.
I suppose I was. And Zoe, do they have access to the bill language on the transit bill?
Yeah, I was looking for the public facing what we can share with them, and I will put that in the chat. I think it includes the transit bill. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to add that Cole mentioned is it was a really I think it was a great process too, in that we were able to, I think there were some outcomes in terms of some really important relationship building. And so for the Moving Maine network to be part of this conversation and really have a lot of the major transit players who lead the Maine Transit Association say, yes, we should include mobility management in this, was, I think, it was a win for us in terms of, regardless of what happens with the bill itself, there is now this unified voice around this is a need. And it includes these different parts. We need the planning, we need the operations funds, and we also need the coordination. And we had, some of us were invited to talk with folks at DOT, including the commissioner, and really speaking with a unified voice that these are the things we need. It's not either or, it's and. So thank you so much to Josh and Cole. I'm going to continue on and talk a bit about the Complete Streets, Safe Streets bills. Cole, if you need to jump, That's no problem, and
do.
we'll catch up with you. Thank you.
Yes, and
Um,
Zoe, you have my email, so feel free to share with anyone if they have any questions after this meeting.
Absolutely. And one thing we do want to ask people, and I'll put this out right now in case folks have to jump early, is if you would like to be kept in the loop about the bills going to hearings, please just say, keep me in the loop in the chat, or email me after, and we'll add you to our list. There'll be a fact sheet for this bill. There'll be, again, we want to make it as easy as possible for folks to give their testimony. So one thing that that we're sharing is this, and I'm actually going to put this in the chat right now, but is this what you need to know to testify? So this is something you can take a look at anytime, and then we'll be giving people updates on, okay, this bill is now, it's been printed, it's going to be, there'll be a public hearing on such and such date, and then you can decide to give your testimony as you can go in person, you can testify virtually, you can send a letter. Really, a weird gift of COVID is that there's now more access to providing testimony. Josh, anything you want to add? I feel like I'm a newbie to how this works.
Just in terms of providing testimony at the State House?
Yeah. Kind of demystifying it for
Yeah.
folks.
It's a very simple process. I've trained a lot of folks on how to do it. I think people can be intimidated by sitting in front of this whole horseshoe of legislators. It is an intimidating prospect. But in fact, these legislators, first of all, are very much just residents of Maine that care about their constituency, and they want to hear from you. They love hearing from the public as opposed to a lot of the paid lobbyists who are there who are being paid to say very specific things. They prefer genuine testimony. I think people are concerned that they don't rise to the level of expert when they get to the State House. But as a citizen, your intention is not to be an expert, it's to speak about your lived experience and why legislation will help you. That's informative to legislators. And if they ask you any questions that you don't have the ability to answer at the end of your 3-minute testimony, you can simply say, I don't have the information right now, but I'm happy to follow up with you. And then that provides an opportunity for you to follow up with your legislator or come to a work session, which will be scheduled after the hearing with more information after you've been able to do some research based on the question they ask you. So you can do it virtually, you can do it in person. If you're in person, they ask that you bring 25 printed copies of your testimony so that you can read one and then you can distribute the copies of that testimony out to the legislators. Virtually, we can put a link in for virtual testimony. You simply submit your testimony as a Word or a PDF document, and then they have that document virtually, and you can testify over Zoom or just submit written comments. I hope that was more clarifying than it was confusing.
I think that was helpful, Josh. And I would just add that if you are somebody who is providing testimony on behalf of people you work with, I think that can be very powerful too, to say, I work with, this audience of older adults, people with disabilities. Here are the things I see, and here's how I think this legislation will improve their lives, benefit them. Again, we will be offering talking points that can help. And there is a group of folks who would be happy to, encourage, coach, whatever it is you need.
Right.
Aaron.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I jumped right over you, but I was just going to say, from a human
okay.
perspective, stories are more compelling than statistics. So sharing your story is more important than sharing a bunch of statistics with legislators.
Absolutely. And I saw Aaron come off mute. I didn't know if you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, there is the Transportation Committee is meeting next Tuesday, the 28th from like 1 to 5 p.m. And I'm not entirely sure what the specific topic is, but I've been tasked with the MTA. We're meeting on Friday to draft a formal statement about all of this. So if I Josh, do you know anything? Maybe I should have asked while Cole was still on, but I know something's happening on Tuesday afternoon about all of this.
Yep, and I believe that's the bill LD 259.
Which one is that?
The one that the Maine Transit Association, they had two different avenues to put in their request for that 6.
Oh, the other side. Okay, well, equally as important. So we
Right.
would love, we'd love
Tuesday,
support.
Yeah, Tuesday doesn't pertain to our bill, but it does pertain to a bill that the Maine Transit Association is also supporting. Yeah.
The more immediate ask. Yeah. Okay.
Great. So, oh, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to share this document in the chat. This is the summary of all the Policy Action 2023 proposals. Sections 2 and 3 are the ones that pertain to transportation and mobility. And I am going to talk a little bit now about the complete streets and safe streets, which we're refining our language, and that's part of what actually I would be very interested to hear from folks in the group if they have suggestions of how we can be most impactful. And we will be sharing, as we said, we'll be sharing info as we go along. And so with the complete streets work, we have a working group that is meeting every other Thursday, and then additionally as needed. And so that is an avenue for people to join us and be part of the conversation, be part of making, we say making the sausage, making the vegan sausage, if you're not a meat eater, but it's messy. It can feel messy. It can feel confusing, but the more people we have who get involved with it, the better it's going to be. So we will do a follow-up with the important details here, but I wanted to share, can folks see the screen with the complete streets here? Okay, great. So we have in this section of work of focus, there are 5 bills. I am not going to go into as much detail about all of them. It's like one of the unintended consequences of having 5 bills. But I did want to share somewhat of a high level overview, so you have a sense. So we have within this section we're pretty focused on what are approaches where we can slow cars down. What do we need to do? Because we know that is intimidating. Folks avoid walking and biking and wheeling if they can, when they're scared to be out, when they don't feel safe. And then people, get injured. And then there are many people who it's not a choice for them. That's how they get around. And so they're having to just, grit their teeth and deal with it. So we came up with a sort of a suite of bills that get at this issue in some different ways. And the first one is about establishing a thriving corridors program. And that one would be a way, there are these places that are, folks in the transportation nerds call them stroads. So there are places where there's like Western Ave in South Portland, or, many communities sadly have them where there's like 3 or 4 lanes of traffic. There's commercial uses on the different sides. There's sidewalks, but they're not pleasant places to walk. And there's a lot of parking lot, and they could be filled in and made into better places. I have one right near my house in Portland that I'm working on trying to turn into a thriving corridor. And this is acknowledging that some of the ways we get the better transportation, better mobility in these places is actually through addressing development. And then because we have a housing crisis, that's a lever, that's an important piece right now and motivating a lot of folks. So that's what that one is about. The second one is about allowing expanded use of traffic cameras for school and work zones. That one, the lead on that is Bicycle Coalition of Maine, and that one is already moving along. And need to get, I didn't see where the hearing was on it, but that's probably the soonest one that you would be hearing about testifying. You know, we know from other places that have traffic cameras that it is an effective way of getting people to mind red lights and stop signs and slow down and mind speed limits, and, you know, creates that accountability because people don't want to get a ticket. The third one, and this one I feel like is kind of the biggie, and it's like shooting for the moon, is to have a task force that is focused on this Vision Zero concept. So Vision Zero, for folks who know, it's an approach that uses multiple strategies to reduce traffic, well, to eliminate traffic fatalities and serious injuries. And so you do, it's sort of like, what are all the things that we can do? We slow cars down by making it, you know, upping enforcement, lowering speed limits, using traffic calming, you know, narrowing roadways. So the idea with this bill is we would establish a state level task force that's made up of the people who have the ability to make things happen and people who can inform what's needed and really move the needle on this for Maine. It feels like there's a lot of momentum around these conversations right now, and we watched what other states have been doing and think that this could be a powerful way to bring the conversation out of just saying like, oh, it's only DOT that gets to decide this, and maybe sometimes the transportation committee, to make it that it's a decision. These decisions, the solutions and the decisions are shared amongst a wider group. And that's the goal for that. These last two are focused, well, I'll say the fourth one is about giving communities the ability to lower speed limits. And so the thing to picture is like places where they've said, we're going to make it 25 miles an hour everywhere in our city or in our town, or in like a central area. We couldn't do that right now in Maine. There's a process that municipalities have to go through with the Department of Transportation, and many folks agree that that the approach, and folks, our partners at DOT have, you know, acknowledged things are changing and there's a need for updating how we set speed limits. We think that this legislation could get us there faster. So we're hopeful that can, you know, we can make it happen. This one, we're really excited to get Senator Rick Bennett as a sponsor. He's in a rural community. And so what we really strive for is to emphasize that this is a solution that's needed in many places. This is not like a city thing or a suburban thing. This is an issue everywhere. And so we tried to come up with an approach that could really benefit everywhere in Maine. This last one, an act to increase street safety, it's really about getting Maine to be fully implementing the complete streets policy that we have on the books for our DOT. So spelling out, what does it mean to implement that policy? So there isn't as much gray area in it. And, you know, we know that for folks who are working on road projects and their engineers, they use checklists for everything. So let's give a checklist for the complete streets policy. So these are all, the document that I am screen sharing is the one that I put in the chat. So that is available to you to, you know, to look at on your own time. We will follow up with the link to the bills, many of which you can look at the language. So these, well, with the exception of this traffic cameras, none of these are out as official bills yet, but I can share the language that you can peruse on your own time. So any questions? I know there are a lot there, and what we're encouraging people to do is to think about like where, you know, you may not have time to come to testify on every bill, what's the one or two that you feel most strongly about, and let us know and we'll help you focus on those. Any questions? Any comments? I guess just I want to sort of invite in, one thing we find really valuable of these meetings is that it's a time to network, share what's going on in your neck of the woods. So I would just sort of open it up if you want to comment on any of the legislation, if you want to say, oh, I think you're going to need to think about, you know, getting an older adult to testify. I think you need to make sure you know that you talk more about safe streets than complete streets. Like, it's all fair game. So we'll sort of open it up for networking, commenting, questions. Sarah, go for it.
Thanks so much for, first of all, I was involved in none of this work, all this amazing months of everyone collaborating in such a deep way. So I'm so appreciative. And I'm also really appreciative of this download for those of us who are so on the periphery of things. I guess I had one question. Do you feel like there's particular opposition that you kind of already know will show up and that we could try to speak to from our individual experience as practitioners or as folks with lived experience? I'm just sort of wondering about that. Not to go like to the negative side of things, but I'm just wondering if there's anything we could particularly know. Yeah.
Josh, do you want to answer that one from the transit bill perspective first?
Yeah, we haven't premeditated a lot of opposition. I think we're mostly focused on pulling together a large body of people who represent a diverse amount of reasons for why they want to see this happen. We've also been in coordination with the Maine Department of Transportation. So not to say that MDOT is in opposition to transit bills often, but just that it's important to make sure that they're in the loop and it's not a surprise to them, so they don't feel they have to come out and disagree. So we don't see that being a big point of tension, which is exciting. You know, I don't know in particular if there are going to be others in opposition that are particularly in favor of highway operations. I think the big question is, when it comes to any funding bill that asks for money from the general fund, is, you know, are people going to oppose it simply because we're asking for money for something that hasn't previously been funded at that level? So we'll see whether that is a factor.
Thank you, Josh. From the complete streets, safe streets side, I think our challenge we're anticipating is that Maine DOT will oppose, especially the speed limit bill, and that what we're anticipating is that the message will be that it's not needed, that the work is already happening, and I do understand that a internal committee of some kind has been formed to look at how speed limits are set. And I would like to think that we are part of the reason for that. So that could be, you know, sometimes that's, you know, you don't, well, I mean, with the example of how we originally got the complete streets policy in Maine, was that it was a piece of legislation that didn't pass, but prompted a task force to be formed and a policy to be developed. So I think we've tried to keep the lines of communication really open and similar to what Josh was saying. I mean, we had, for the Complete Streets Working Group, we had several DOT staff who attended almost every meeting and had some really good conversations. And I think what I would like to see is if there's a way for people with the really specific technical expertise to voice it, that would be helpful. I think it's a little different. Like we can turn people out to say, this is important. Slowing speeds is important because my life is on the line. That'll be important. But on this topic, I think it's likely that then there'll be like somebody with engineering expertise who says, but this isn't the way to do it. But we've actually heard from a lot of people who work in transportation planning that it is needed and they agree with it. And so I think we're trying to figure out, can we get some of those folks? Could we get even like an association of folks to voice? So that's being, conversations are happening about how we could get that voice. Because it can be very powerful when somebody says, this is my area of expertise. And I say it's not needed from the state, So how do we address that when that gets voiced to the committee, provide a counterpoint to it? We would welcome help with that.
Zoe, have you ever reached out to anyone at Easter Seals about that kind of stuff? They have right now, as far as I know, unless something changed, they're the only nonprofit agency providing certification and travel training, because they kind of started travel training with the developmentally disabled that they worked with like 30 years ago. But as a result, they have become kind of experts in the field, and they have very powerful literature and materials about safe streets and how dangerous certain speeds can be for people who don't understand signs and are visually impaired, low vision. They have a wealth of resources that would be worth tapping into, and they're lovely. You could just call them and chat, and they'll be happy to help out.
That's a great idea. Thank you, Erin. And it's interesting because that local connection, the connection to Easter Seals in Maine, is one that is like been on my to-do list. So because nationally they're one of the partners that runs the National Center for Mobility Management. So that's a really good idea. Thank you. Diane.
Yeah. So thank you, Erin, for bringing that up, because I was thinking about a time to introduce, we already, with Division for the Blind and Visually Impaired, we have among our staff trained orientation and mobility specialists. And I know that they have some of them across the state have participated in DOT sponsored meetings and, talked about, when you're creating an environment that's accessible, what kinds of things would you want to implement or put in place for folks who are visually impaired or blind? So I know that they've come to the table in the past, but again, I just want to, say if any one of you has questions or wants to speak with an orientation mobility specialist or wants resources and information, I can certainly get that to folks that are interested.
Thank you, Diane. Yeah, I think I've really appreciated talking to the folks. So Kathy Claridge, one comes to mind. There's so much you don't think about if you don't have that going on. And so I think that would be really powerful to be able to tap folks to testify. Other comments, things people wanted to share, questions? I see Nick shared in the chat that he's the coordinator for Rangeley Health Rides program, and that the program helps people get to their health appointments outside of the Rangeley area. And he put his number in the chat and his email. Thank you, Nick, for that. Do you want to add anything? Is he still here? I'm just looking at, it's hard to organize the people who are not, who are
I'm
just
not seeing
names
Nick's
on the
on the
screen.
room, but I do have his contact information.
Okay.
And yeah, regional transit providers like his smaller operations will be great folks to show up and testify. So I'll reach out to him for sure.
Great. Well, I have one other piece to share with folks, and while you're thinking of the thing you want to share, but we have, there's a screening of a really powerful documentary film coming up that Moving Maine is one of the sponsors for. and hosted by the Maine Trails Coalition. They're doing screenings around the state. The first one is tomorrow night. There's a link here that you can follow. And the street project is, I mean, it's just an amazing story of a group of folks who got fed up with the streets that they were dealing with, and they took action. And so those screenings will be an opportunity to bring people together in a physical space to watch the film together and then have discussion. And each one includes some, I believe actually that Maine's bicycle pedestrian, or I think I'm actually getting to, it's different. He's the active transportation planner. So Dakota Hewlett from Maine DOT will be at almost every one. And then depending on the region, there will be some other folks there. And so they will be, so starting tomorrow in Portland, and then there's one next week in Augusta, and then they'll be in Bangor and Biddeford in April. And I believe that it's a free, I should know this off the top of my head, but I believe that it's free. It is free. And so just a great way. I know, we haven't necessarily gotten to be together in person a whole lot through COVID, and it doesn't work for everyone, but nice opportunity to gather with other folks to talk about these issues. Any final thoughts, comments? Okay, well, I think I'll close us out. We'll have some follow-ups. Did throw a few things in the chat, but as these bills go into public hearing mode, you'll be hearing from us. And please, consider voicing, you're here for a reason. You're here because you care about better mobility. And so this is like the moment to show up, and showing up could mean that you dash off a quick email and send it in. And if you have stage fright like me for things like this, I'll just say it's really like you feel really good after, and you're like, that was easy. So just encourage people to lend their voices. Our topic for April will be about talking about affordability. Haven't totally fleshed that out yet. So if you have thoughts about how access to transit and transportation looks for folks who have limited budgets or who have no money, we'd like to hear from you. I love having examples from around the state. So I know already have a couple more like urban suburban examples, and love to hear some other ones. So please be in touch with those and take good care. It's nice to see folks' faces. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks all.